Good morning, YouTube. Episode 5. I got my coffee ready. I tried to do this yesterday. It just didn't work out. I had some things to do in the morning, so I thought I could do a tea talk in the afternoon, but the overhead sun was just too much. We did have some clouds coming and going, but And this right now is the only spot that I can kind of put together to do this in, so let's get going, move forward. What we're going to talk about today, MIDI, Musical Instrument Digital Interface. I'm not going to talk about what it is per se. I'm going to talk about how I learned MIDI and my experiences learning MIDI. I was actually trained. It was taught to me. I didn't just pick it up by myself. This was back in 1993 when I was first introduced to it. Let me think about that for a second. So yeah, I started back to the university in the spring, which is kind of weird because it always kind of, messes me up when I'm trying to gauge date ranges on events in my lifetime. So starting in the spring means that you start at the beginning of the year, and I tend to think that the next semester will be the next year. So my first semester coming back was spring of 1993 in recording industry management, which we now know is called audio engineering, and I studied just basic stuff. I can't even remember what classes that I took. It was like intro to mass communication, intro to something else communication. I don't even remember, to tell you the truth. I could get my transcript and go back and find out, and it would probably jog my memory. Oh yeah, I forgot all about that, and bring a lot of memories back. It's kind of cool to go back and take a look at your college transcript if you haven't done that in a while, you graduated. It will put perspective on the events that happened during that time period, and you'll realize how much you've actually forgotten and how much you sort of... Trust me, I know, because I go back and look, oh wow, I got that completely wrong. So when I came back, it was an interesting, got a truck coming, I have a little bit of noise here, sorry. When I came back, it was an interesting period of my life. I was at a really down, one of the lowest periods in my lifetime. Probably like the first time I'd actually sort of hit rock bottom as a failure, and learning to pick yourself back up and rise back up to the top. And it was this program and learning MIDI itself that actually helped me kind of rise up. When I came back, I had failed out previous. Maybe I'll talk about that in another episode, but for right now, let's just kind of focus on moving forward from a certain point. I had pretty much failed out of college. I was coming back into college, and I really wanted to take it seriously. It was a second chance and everything. At this point, I was about 21 years old, so I really should, at that age, you start college at 18, you're ready to graduate, not start over. So when I came back, it was important that I succeed. And my first semester was okay. It was an introduction. It also introduced me back to the band scene in this town, which was just taking off. It was about to absolutely explode, and I was right at the cusp of all of that action that was about to happen. So I played in a really awful band that I'll talk about someday. Bless our hearts, but we were pretty bad. And this led me to hanging out with other people and networking, which is a very important skill that I did not learn at that time. And so, yeah, that was pretty much that kind of first semester. Summer rolls around. I don't think I took any courses. Just hung out with my new friends who played instruments. So we had various different bands that we were trying to get going. And then fall of 1994 hit, and I took two very, very difficult courses for people who don't already know the base material. One was this MIDI class, which was, I believe, called Introduction to Electronic Music, and the other was just Introduction to Analog Studio Recording. I forget what it was called. I have to go back and look at my transcript again. And they changed the names of these courses as the decades go by, too. So the analog recording class, that was my first Piranha hour, and that was the Piranha hour that year, that semester, where I just completely failed. And the hours that I did get were like just at the bottom of the barrel. It didn't matter anyways because I ended up dropping that course. That's another story, not for this not for this episode. So took that class, and on the other hand, I took the electronic music course, where I learned synthesizer. In this particular case, we were learning, I want to say, linear algorithm synthesis. LA synthesis is what it would probably be best known as, which is mainly taking Rompler sound sources and mixing them with raw oscillators and getting the sort of hybrid sound. All very digital though. We had zero analog equipment apart from our mixers. That was it. Everything else was completely digital. So I signed up for this course. I had the best teacher, really, and I just had a lot of misconceptions going in, where these things, all trouble students have these, and it's a shame. It's an ongoing problem that we haven't solved in understanding what it is that you don't know that you don't know. Maybe it will never be solved. That's what we call an NP incomplete problem. So that's a real conundrum. And it's really up to the student individually to understand what that student is missing. It just is. I mean, someone else can't necessarily, if they can, that's great, but teach a man to fish, give him a fish, that kind of thing. In my particular case, my mistake, my error in thinking was I didn't understand what we were doing with MIDI. So when we talk about these things, we talk about what it is, and definitions, and defining all these terms. The one thing we don't talk about enough is what are we doing with this stuff? Are we hot riding around town with this stuff? What are we doing? That was the hardest part for me in understanding electronics and electricity and current flow was what are we doing with it? Why do we want current to flow this way or that way? And once you understand, things start to become a lot more understandable. So in my case, what I thought MIDI was doing was I thought that we were basically transmitting digital audio, like audio digitally, which is kind of what we do now via USB audio, which is interesting. So I thought it was just like a way of having VSTs essentially, like a sound card and a VST integrated into one. I thought that that's what we were doing. I didn't understand. Well, I have to explain a little bit what MIDI is for those of you who don't know what MIDI is now. But I think it's important to really kind of first go over the misconceptions, because I think a lot of people have these misconceptions. And since we're now in a sort of dark ages again, it's very easy for people to not understand what's going on behind the scenes, because all of this is now facilitated and taken care of for you by computers behind the scenes. Your VSTs that you're using, your DAWs. Anytime that you're doing any sort of interoperability between applications within your computer, you may or may not be using MIDI behind the scenes, but you wouldn't know. It's not until you actually start getting into the external hardware interconnectivity that you start to realize, okay, these cables are different. These cables are different from those cables. Obviously, they transmit different kinds of signals. So in my case, going into it, my background before I started audio engineering and electronic music was I had experience programming an Alesis HR16 drum machine. I had experience sequencing a Roland JX3P synthesizer. It did not have the program control ability, so I only used the presets really. And all of this was in the late 80s, early 90s. Right after the JX3P, I was introduced to the next Alesis drum machine, the SR16. And to this day, I still haven't played around with the SR18. I have an SR16 right now, and I don't feel the need to upgrade to an 18. They're definitely better, but I never use the 16 hardly anyways. So here I am studying recording engineering in general in the fall of 1993, and it is the end of 93 going into here we are in October of 1993, and I realize that I'm not going to be able to do well in my analog engineering class, the studio engineering class. So I drop it, and I decide to focus all efforts on electronic music, because also at that point in time I was kind of failing. I don't remember what was going on, but I was not understanding the concepts. So I realized, okay, I have got to make this work, because this is why I added the little aside at the beginning that I was coming into it from an area of failure. It was very important to me to not fail again, especially not in this arena. I was given a really nice second chance. So what I did is I just grabbed our textbooks that we used for the electronic music class. And our textbook was literally the Roland D70 manual, the EMU Proteus manual. What else did we use? Mark of the Unicorn. Performer. At the time it was called Mark of the Unicorn Performer. It wasn't even called Digital Performer. I was there when they made the transition from Performer to Digital Performer by adding in the ability to record audio wave files. Here's that missing picture again. This is what I'm thinking that we're doing in this course is that we're doing electronic music. Well, electronic music is just recording audio to the computer, right? No. Not at all. Now, just as a quick aside, because I know some of you might be thinking this right now, what's very interesting is that when I was taking these electronic music courses, we were told that analog was a thing of the past, and at the time it was. We really definitely thought that we were not going to return to a lot of these analog synthesis devices and methods because the digital methods were just so much better. That's another topic, and that's another debate that I don't really care to have, to tell you the truth. I'm not interested in those kinds of things. I'm interested in music and interesting sounds, and I really don't care what the means of producing them are. Even sampling, that's a totally viable way of doing things, and I'm on the fence about sampling for the most part, but I'm not ever going to protest against sampling because I use it and I enjoy using it. So I just hit the nose to the grindstone, and I just kept reading everything about that D70 manual. I started reading all my other manuals and just trying to understand and go back over, okay, what am I missing about MIDI? And finally it dawned on me what was happening. It was explained to me what was happening, but I guess that information finally got through my thick skull and made it into my brain. And that is what we do with MIDI is we remotely control another synthesizer. We can take a synthesizer, stick it over here, and get a remote controlled keyboard, if you will. That's not what's going on, but for all intents and purposes, let's think of it that way if you need to. And I can hit notes on these keys and cause this synthesizer to play those notes. And more importantly, I can record that I'm playing these notes within a certain time period and actually store that as a sequence on another device and have that device play it back anytime I want to. It's a means of automation. Back in those days, we definitely talked about automation, but not like we talk about it today. And MIDI is simply a means of automation. That's it. There is no audio information that is transferred. It is not an audio signal. It is a strictly digital transmission that all it does is it tells a synthesizer to play a note, to stop a note, and to do other things that we can call control changes, which are the sort of downfall of MIDI. It's definitely that's where the rough edges of MIDI start to really show themselves, is when you start getting into using control change the way that you want to. And I think this is where people get the biggest criticism of MIDI right now, is not really fully understanding, So a lot of times when I hear people talking about MIDI, if somebody comes in, they're like looking at somebody doing a modular stream where they're employing a lot of control voltage and gate signals, somebody might ask, okay, what's this MIDI that I hear about, And from that context, usually the first thing that we're going to talk about is with control voltages, we can have an LFO that covers this, an infinite range of finite values whenever you want to get from one area to the next. But with MIDI, you only have 7 bits. You only got 128 discrete values that you can represent a curve with. Neighbor driving by. Anyways, so that is a serious limitation when you compare the two. Let's back up for a second. The most important thing to understand is that MIDI came about to solve all kinds of problems that CD and gate just weren't able to handle, and they still ain't able to handle. MIDI is a workhorse that is much bigger workhorse than CV and gate. It just is. And I guess the big disconnect that we're having here is that most people don't use MIDI as an LFO to control LFO type kind of things, to take one parameter, a filter sweep from area A to area X across whatever period of time. Really what we use MIDI 90% of the time for is just to sequence the notes themselves. This is the hard part about using CV gate with anything. Doesn't matter if it's modular, semi-modular. I mean, you know, take the Korg SQ1 sequencer, for example. It spits out CV gate the same as it spits out MIDI for the most part. Now, it probably does a better job at sequencing with CV gate than it does with MIDI, because generally speaking, what we're talking about here is we're wanting to tweak the controls ourselves, and some of the, or we're going to automate the tweaking of the controls that we would normally do ourselves. So yeah, some of that is probably better lent, but it's only one device. You see, it's a limitation. The SQ1 is called a 1 because it's just one channel. That's it. I mean, you can't do anything more. You can copy the signal and have two synthesizers being automated in tandem doing pretty much the exact same thing. You can, you know, maybe delay one of the signals a little bit. But no, MIDI completely blows all of that out of the water, because you're able to sequence 16 synthesizers, 16 tracks on one MIDI cable. That's not bad. So if your sequencer has one MIDI out, that means it can handle really up to 16 different synthesizers and drum machines, whatever you want to throw in, whatever combination you want to throw in there. Most sequencers don't even handle that much. Like the Octatrack, for example, handles 8 tracks. The Engine does 8 tracks. My Squirt Pyramid does 64 tracks. And that's why I love it so much. I mean, that is a DAW in a box. When you look at your DAW does unlimited amount of MIDI tracks. I'm pretty sure you can set up different MIDI buses. So if you get one and max out at 16, you can just open up another MIDI channel, I think, on your DAW and have another 16. There may be a limitation to how many channels or whatever they're called that you can open up. Could be a limitation of how much RAM you're employing, and so just, you know. But yeah, 64 is plenty. I mean, if you think about 64 tracks on a physical analog console, you know, whoa, that's crazy. I mean, I can't even reach that far. So, yeah, so talking a little bit about what we learned in these courses. Maybe I'll be able to give you a tour at the facilities back over this way one of these days as well. They've moved out of the room that we used to be in, and they've moved to another area in the building, which I think is kind of cool, maybe. I don't know. The old building was isolated. It was private to the rest of activities going on, everything. And this new location is like, boom, it's right there in the middle of everything with glass windows. So, take your pick. We used the Roland D70. We had an Eden Proteus 1, 2, and 3, I believe, on a rack. We also had on the rack Kai S1000 sampler. I'm pretty sure it was the S1000. I've got my notes somewhere buried somewhere, and I'll find them. And I've been wanting to figure out, okay, which one. It might have been the 1200, but it was pretty cool. And like I said, we had a mixer, and then we had Macintoshes. These were, what were those things? Those are the old Macs. You know, they're called something. I should have done my notes. Way before the MacBook Pros and all that. This was back when everybody was using Windows. No like households were really using Macintoshes. The only people back then that were using Macs were professional graphics and sound engineering type kind of houses. It was just, I don't know, like all the applications were there for it, the support was there for it. That's what everybody in those industries used back then. It wasn't until Apple started showing off using BSD, that Unix variant under their hood, that started getting the software development community on board using MacBook Pros around the mid-2000s. And so yeah, that was our workstations. We had about 7 stations, I think, in that area. Like or 7 or 8, and they were like 2. I think one had 3 and then 2 and 2, so it was an odd number. But they were kind of stepped back. So if you're looking at the side, it was like a theater. Everything went up. So you had like layer 1, 2, 3, and 4. I think you had 3 stations, 2 stations, 2 stations, 2 stations. Way back here we had a cabinet where we had like some electronic percussion. I think we had a wind controller back there, some software that more intermediate students could have access to that and use it for their projects. At the very bottom though was the teacher station. This was awesome. Behind it was a huge projector, a screen for the projector, so the teacher, the professor could have their screen showing on the screen behind them, their monitor that is. Any audio could be routed to the front and to the main speakers, so you could hear. Everybody had headphones, but you could request to have your music played into the main speakers, so you get a better idea of what it might sound like in a different arrangement. And wow, it was great. It was so much fun. So that first class, that my first semester, the first introduction class, once I dropped the other course that I was doing terribly in, I devoted all of my time to really studying that, I was able to catch up, and I got an A out of the course. Not only that, but I kind of had the best final project. Our projects and those courses were music to produce a song, which was awesome about those classes. So for this one, I actually had a long piece of music that I used, and I incorporated like just about every trick that we were told about and taught. And yeah, I put a lot of time into this song. Really what ended up happening is as soon as my disconnect got connected and I understood what was going on, I just ate it up. I'm so happy that I was able to discover that, because it would have been a real shame if I just dropped both courses, and I don't know what I would have done at that point in my life. All I wanted to do at that moment in time was be a drummer. That's really it. I had gotten into college. I never really wanted to go to college in the first place, but I was kind of forced into it. I did okay, but since my heart wasn't there, I had no desire to do it whatsoever. All I wanted to do was play drums, and it's next to impossible to really focus on something, get rained on, when you don't want to do it. When your heart is just somewhere else, and that's all that you ever want to do is that other thing. So the first semester was basically studying just the basics. The second semester we got into a little bit more, not songwriting techniques, because really that was not a prerequisite going into this, was being a songwriter. Engineers don't have to be songwriters, so even though you're needing to write a song, you need to produce some kind of music, nobody judged you on the music that you produced. It was more just the production techniques, and were you able to do this technique, and so forth. I can't remember what the requirements were, just basically simple stuff like you have to sequence at least 4 parts. One of them has to be a drum part. There has to be, I don't know, I can't even see, it wasn't even one has to be a harmony part. You could literally have probably just the same melody, copy and paste it to 2 other instruments, and that would be totally acceptable. The next semester, as I was going to say, was more intermediate. We started getting into the concept of chunks, where you have all of your MIDI tracks, and they're all just linearly laid out like so, just a big mess. And then you can say, okay, I want this area, this 16 bar area, this 32 bar area to be a chunk. And it would take you to like another layer where you would see all that stuff now represented as just a box here. And you could take that box and copy it a couple times, have another box for your chorus. Yeah, you get the point. So this is more taking things into a real songwriting structure, meaning I want a verse, I want a chorus, I want a bridge, and other things. Personally, I didn't really care for producing music in this regard. I thought it was just as easy to keep everything totally laid out and linear. There's a term for that. I can't think of what it's called now. It's what they use in video games when they refer to the maps. But yeah, just everything laid out linear style and not jumping to another layer and so forth. The third semester was interesting because most people didn't take the third semester. Really, most people didn't take the second semester course in electronic music. Only 9 people took electronic music, the advanced electronic music class, and I was one of them. Our project in that class was to take a 3-4 minute clip from a movie. I chose The Highlander. We had a number of different choices, about 5 different choices that we could pick from. One of them was the Batman animated movie that it came out recently back then. Maybe you remember what it was. I can't remember what the other ones were. I definitely picked The Highlander. It was the final battle scene where he defeats the Kurgan and all the glass comes shattering down, and he has the quickening. So we had to replace the background music, we had to replace all of the sound effects, and we had to replace the dialogue. So it was really a film production, an audio for film production class. It's just a shame that it wasn't tied into the mass communication program that they have there. A quick aside, this is a little bit of a rant now. Maybe I've already said this in a past episode, but it really kind of breaks my heart that in just about any university, college that you go to, all of the individual departments, they don't work with each other. They're at competition with each other, and it makes no sense at all. So in this particular case, it was the recording industry, or the audio engineering program, and the broadcast, the mass communications, television, radio. They didn't talk to each other. I mean, we as our students over here and their students were over there, we didn't do too many projects together, and it's a real shame because I think a lot of good information dissemination is there to be had, and a lot of good networking on top of that. But I think when you get out into these industries and you get a job, you find out that they're isolated too, and they don't talk to each other at all. Another quick aside, if you don't mind, this is where electronics gets very interesting when you start getting specialized or studying specialized areas into these things, and it's like, oh wow. The real big one, the biggest disconnect is the broadcast industry and the recording, the audio engineering communities. It's just amazing the disconnect between these two. It's like they hate each other. I'm just a computer dude. So that's why I got out of all of this. Was by the time that I had graduated in audio engineering, I wanted to have nothing to do with it anymore. The writing was on the wall. I could see where everything was going, and I didn't care for it. It's kind of like right now where I see the writing is on the wall with the internet, and I kind of want to get away from it. It's like, how can we create the next internet? Another layer stack that totally has nothing to do with the one that you're using now. Sorry, I got a bit on an aside there, but yeah, after I graduated from audio engineering, I just I didn't want to go work in a studio. I didn't want to sit here and I got into it because I wanted to learn the analog recording techniques. I actually got to record a band. Okay, so excuse me a sec. We're talking about fall of 93. In the spring of 94 is when I retook the audio engineering class, and I got an A in that class this time. And I had a blast. It was so much fun to actually record to real analog 2-inch tape. We're talking real analog sources to real analog tape. Now when I hear people talking about all these awesome vinyl albums that they get, I'm just scratching my head because I know that came from a digital source. You're listening to a vinyl record whose master was originally digital. It still sounds great, don't get me wrong. It sounds great to your ears at the end of the day. Isn't that all that really matters? If you enjoy it. Don't let other people tell you what you can't enjoy, right? So hey, if you love albums, then it really shouldn't matter that the source is digital, but I feel like the industry is just screwing us all over royally every step of the way and laughing all the way to the bank. But since music was going to become all digital, and since all music production was going to be from behind a computer, pushing a mouse around and having virtual knobs and faders on a screen, I decided why not just forget all of that and go study computer science, which is precisely what I did. So that probably should wrap up this talk for now. I think, we could talk about what MIDI is and what it does, but I'd rather talk about what MIDI means to me. than what it actually is. And what MIDI means to me is the world. So have a good one. See you next. No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die.